Hello everyone, today we start the series on doctoral tales, relatively to the experience that I matured through my research and essentially as an advice to anybody that wants to try the same thing or maybe wants to relate who has done it maybe in another field than medieval history like mine and or even among medievalists, my specific subject, my specific topic, time, place, and so on. And in general, I presume mostly for those that do not know what this is and are curious about it, either because they would like to become PhDs for some reason, and therefore you may say, but why should I become that? What is this in the first place? And or secondly, for understanding, and this can be interesting really for everybody, like what's the mechanism that stands behind essentially the highest level of education at this point existing in the world, formally speaking, right? And you know that I've been quite vocal in a critical sense about scholarship, about academy, and so on, because of course, seeing the thing from the within, you understand what are the things that do not work, where the thing is heading. Like what I would like to stress is not bragging about the fact that I am a PhD now. It's about the fact of saying being aware of people, be aware of people like me, right? Because not always, at all, we are as competent, as experienced, as intelligent, as developed as in theory this formal title, this path, this career should essentially make us be, right? It's not really a big deal, right? First of all, I could start telling you what is actually a doctoral research and title and thesis in that sense. But I presume, I come across people sometimes I've never even heard of that, and honestly, I was in that pool up until relatively recently, right? I knew of that, of course, ever since I began university. I started university, and I wanted to know what were the perspectives in general. I think, of course, in high school, I remember I was asking one of my professors that had done the thing, what it is like, right? I was more interested in, and as I saw the thing at the time, right, becoming a professor as a professional vest, right, saying how do I score big in the scale of social status, all those things. Even though I never cared about the status, not even the money per se, but really like feeling accomplished as an individual. Saying, well, what have you done of your life, right? And that's why the motivation is important. But let's say I never actually understood or knew what that really was, right? One of the reasons why I talk about these things, and I talked, at length, and we will keep doing it if you want, about other stages of education. Can be school, can be the bachelor's, the master's, all these things, because it is important. And for me, as I'm an only son, and I had never met like with my parents are in other fields. They didn't get a PhD, and so I didn't have anybody who would tell me exactly the path like that I did, like in my subject, in my in that environment, and so on. So I was completely unaware of that, and just by character and goals and attitude, etc., and lifestyle, I just didn't care about these things. I have colleagues that are all in with one thing with university in itself. They like to space within it. They like to have relations within it, to know everything, how the mechanism, the bureaucracy, the career work. I basically know nothing of this, so maybe I'm not even the best person to tell, let's say, this broader and arguably more important aspects of the same. I'm here just to say what I experienced as I went through, because before doing this, I had no clue, or at least that I know what it is concretely compared to expectations. I hope I can offer some kind of perspective on this, and naturally there is yet another consideration to make, that is, doctoral researchers are not the same everywhere, right? They're not the same everywhere, with very big differences. In fact, different institutions, different um, in fact, faculties, topics. Every research is different by itself, right? Not even my colleagues in medieval history, for example, we wrote and researched about very different things, right? Even when it's literally the same time. I had a colleague that finished the same, person that I eventually remained in cooperation with because of things like conferences we do there. Well, he studied the same period I did in my same country, practically almost the same places that I studied, but frankly, like he studied ecclesiastical stuff, I studied military stuff. So we were. It's not that we were even too like it's that he's the priest guy or I'm kind of the warrior guy. Like we are kind of more both kind of secular, you know, pretty, pretty plain and standard, curious people, and that wasn't the point. But we have barely anything in common. So that can give you the dimension of how difficult it is for me even just to tell you what this whole thing is and also to provide you with a motivation. But also today, and I think this is very important for the future of education, we have to be wary of the differences existing in different university systems worldwide, within the same West, within the same Europe. From my perspective, because I've known people who have gotten into such things abroad, in other countries. I've been talking with professors, with met, but so I have an idea more or less of how certain things work, even though I don't have this dramatic experience. For example, in calls for papers, I just wrote a very few stuff yet because the research I chose specifically was very demanding, and in that case I invested. That's one of the motivations, for example, investing in a research that has a bigger goal, right, historiographically speaking. So we will look at all these things step by step because there are really different facets of all this that are kind of crucial eventually to define not just your research but eventually the person that you're going to become, right? If I have to be honest, yes, this experience changed me a lot, right? And of course I began, I think for the first time, to research truly on my own, truly doing something that was truly my own work in terms of intentions, of method, of references, because before it's like much less mediated. It's I can't say that bachelor or masters are becoming a formality, but almost, right? Especially if you have this further ambition, and of course whoever stops at a certain point tends to say, okay, well, it was enough here. What is beyond is too difficult, and it was like that. Like I snobbed a little bit. It's not about difficulty, right? It's about because I know many people who bail out from PhDs, and there are different reasons, right? What bails out of a PhD is not just somebody who doesn't know what to do in his own life, or who is just couldn't make it, or it was just an act of arbitrary. No, there are very serious things that happen. Sometimes it's a very healthy, deliberate, clear choice. Sometimes it can be also something tragic. There's a consistently higher rate of depression, for example, among doctoral students. There is a pressure that you have to handle. We will address this because it's and explaining why that pressure exists. Or because you may think, but doctors that have to save somebody's life, being covered in blood from head to toe, like those have a pressure, right? Firemen who have to get into literal hell, those have the pressure. Military has post-traumatic stress disorder, but don't think that the expectation, the motivation, and what the work is actually required for a theoretical, in fact, most of the theoretical research like this is easy, right? Because it's really not, and I can relate because I consider myself a relatively resistant person, exactly from a moral point of view, and what I went through was very fascinating from my perspective. I think that I took it better than most people, but also I felt at some point the burden. I felt at some point the so-called imposter syndrome. I felt a lot of things that I realized that now I succeeded, so I can look back at them and say, well, I don't have to worry about it anymore. But I also realized that it was unpredictable. even the outcome was unpredictable. I think I personally would have not failed the research, but there was some point at which I would have required more time that would have probably impacted on my psyche and all these things. But and I'm also satisfied, generally speaking, of having properly acquired true. In fact, as I was saying before, doing finally something that was truly my own thing, done well from a scientific. Because I've always done my own thing, but one thing is how you do it, and I explained better the thing naturally during the. I plan to make multiple videos because they are very complex things individually, and they make you understand how in fact you can find yourself sometimes in the situation. So this is probably arguably the most important and also most difficult video to make relatively to the motivation, right? Because the motivation is as different as the nature of the research, and actually more, because it's about your entire life. It's about where you come from, what's your background, what do you think, like where are you in your life at that point, right? And so I cannot draw literally a theoretical guidance for saying, why you may want to become a PhD, or whether that is such, how it is going to work in your life, right? Because you are the only person who can discover that by doing the thing. Of course, there are certain parameters that are important and that can reflect different motivations, of course. So as we were saying at the beginning, this is in theory the highest title you can have. Basically, there's nothing superior than that. You can have of course, to develop, because that's the point, to develop a curriculum, right? And you can become a professor, but the title of PhD, that's the thing that remains as the gold standard. Like you are that level, and effectively you become a PhD eventually to grow in the selection, to enter at universities, to teach as a professor, because that's eventually a thing you can do. And then there is all a career there. So of course, those are the highest levels of education. This is factually speaking. But this, from a formal point of view, the PhD should be like the standard of scientific proficiency and expertise and professionalism for having effectively concluded this research that lasts years, and that is evaluated according to different criteria, depending, of course, also on the research in itself, that, however, are scientific ones, and that should bring some kind of, for which, and your work should present some characteristics, however, such as innovation. We should say essentially a new thing, right? This is true ever since the first thesis you write, right? Of course, those small theses during the classes or for the exams are something else, right? Because you're just training to write to write decent things from a formal point of view, but it's not that you normally discover much of yourself. There are very gifted students, those who have the most brilliant careers. Most of the times were basically about discovering something new, always going in an archive, always being that kind of professorial in tone, which I am definitely not myself by personal inclination. I have a different view of the world, because to me that career is not the center of my life. It's something that I use in a sense to validate it, and that's in part, of course, the motivation that I will explain now. But it's aside from other things in my life, mostly affection, health, and a broader serenity in existence that I think it is truly the most important thing. At least it is for me, but that is a prerequisite in my case to, in fact, do good also in other fields, because I like doing things, and humans normally do. Like they need a job, right? They need to apply themselves. Of course, they should do it also with some degree of pressure, so that's why you need also serenity from the other side, because it has to be a balance between you being, satisfied about your own existence and still, however, working hard to produce something for yourself and ultimately for the community through yourself. At least that's my view. I work self-improvement because I know that's the only way I can be helpful for other people. And I told you these things many times. Also, why do I talk specifically about these things in here? And etc. I hope that it can be helpful in any way. So As I also was saying before, though, so in theory, yes, you should. The reason why you want to get a PhD normally is that I will say getting PhD is the title, right? But if you're not saying doctoral thesis, whatever, you understand what I mean. The reason why you want to become a PhD is that, of course, that should allow you to enter the academic career, right? In a sense, up to some, even a generation ago or more, um, the the PhD was the first step of the academic career. Today, in many ways, it's the last step of the university one. And it has become so because, first of all, much more people become PhDs. So this naturally happened in the Western world, where education is higher in the first place on average, because more people can afford this education, because we need in tertiary, like, ever more, for our civilization to work, ever more theoretical work than before, right? Where the majority of people were fundamentally practically oriented, and just there were a few theoreticians, let's call them in this way, people literally capable of theoretical thinking. Literally, okay, let's not digress on this, but it's a big accomplishment in general in our history, to which we haven't, however, fully adapted, in the sense that part of the reason why PhDs count less today, it's not much because there are many, because if these were literally functional to the civilizational development, that there would be essentially, they would find employment, for example, and this is not the case anymore. It's like with the degrees, right? Degrees first, at the time of your parents, grandparents, the more you go back in time, they were more prestigious, right? And in general, it seems that they were more qualitative under some grounds, or at least that the people who wrote them had also much more tougher means to succeed in that sense, because they were, it was different, but essentially more capacities were required. There is, for example, I wrote something enormous that it would have not been possible, like, before digital means came around, because literally how much time would have required in terms of paper and pencil to write something like it would have been inconceivable, right? But my discipline to attain it was less than somebody would have liked to do it just for the sake of determination at in a previous time, right? So this makes things in a sense more interesting, because there are in scientific work, in publication, in this sense, more spaces to, more things to challenge in general. It's as if the intrinsic weight, the intrinsic in fact quality of these works were more fragile, and therefore you can always exploit that scientifically, right? So this has generated culturally many impressions about properly what are in fact scholars and what they do, and this has even brought people to distrust, in a sense, the scientific community, because the ways also we are, this scientific deterioration is encompassing a bit the whole world, right? We are arriving at a point where we concentrate more on what you feel rather than what is actually real, right? And so this is an anti-scientific proposition. Like, you can't properly do that if you want to make things work, and that this is a huge issue that is going on. I do believe that PhDs as degrees in general, any degree in general, have decreased in quality. There is no doubt of this. At the same time, though, if somebody has really an interest in such fields, say there is still a way to succeed that is, if you want, I could even explain it. I'm personally not very cut for, because again, I'm not exactly for that unprejudiced success just for the sake of it. I have, you have to modulate this on who you are and what's your purpose in life and so on. But we have to be honest as well about the fact that this requires, actually, for other dynamics, a cost that is exemplified by the fact that PhDs today do not actually have a this extremely successful career, right? Surely they have better employment opportunities, offers, etc. They do work more than others after but the goal, that is to say, properly of teaching, academically, and therefore essentially fulfilling the ambition that the doctoral research represents itself, that is often frustrated. Very few PhDs actually work in that field, and it is very frustrating, literally, right? Because there are people who say, oh well, I will get a PhD because that will be useful for finding a better job or something like that. It's a life experience. Why not, right? I personally know, now we'll talk about age, for example. I know people also of a certain age that get their PhDs, and they do it even maybe when they already have a family or they already have a job, because they eventually have their own reason for wanting more, right? That depends from person to person. But in theory, if you want to have a fulfilling, successful career, in theory you should begin as a young person and then pursue the academic career. Well, and this connection is not quite evident at all. As I don't remember stats, but like I think in at this point, in countries like the UK, just one PhD out of 10 manages to teach academically at some point. Before, it wasn't that particularly tremendous. Like, it was 1 out of 5, but in certain contexts, like for example my own, where it's 1 out of 20, you start thinking, why does this happen? Well, there's a trick a little bit, meaning that this is not just a lottery for which just 1 out of 20 gets luckily extracted. In part it is, because when I will talk about this, even the selection to get into a PhD, you are literally, I got in just because surely I had the qualities, but there were not enough places in the selection, and I passed at some point just because one of the tests there was an extraction of that kind, and I got lucky about that. I was good at exploiting that in a sense, but if it had come from another thing, I would have surely not made it. So there are lots of accidents, of course, that happen throughout all this, and it's in part that, but I presume that yes, if you're very, very determined, and if your goal is, and you can afford, right, because it is also a matter of cost in your life, to go on with that path, because you're not scared of being some kind of, in a precarious condition, because you can't wait. You have no problem, in a sense, even to work for free at some point just to get there. Okay, that's fine, you can do it, and probably if you're very driven, you can. But not even at that point, you may be that satisfied, because I know professors, they talk to us, even at, during the introduction to our doctoral path, and they told us what being a professor at the end of the day is, right? At least where I come from, it's mostly bureaucracy. Like 90% is bureaucracy, and then they say, finally you get in that class and you have the freedom of literally talking about whatever you want, which may not be exactly the best thing in absolute terms. I have seen, let's say, even in my university, those things that are legitimately criticized today, in my country it's normal, let's say it's all public, right? So, but it's different from what public means in other countries, right? It depends, in fact, at different levels. But yes, I did see leftism, I did see Marxism, I did see ideologies. I saw even worse than that. But altogether, like, at least in my case, it was not a particularly radicalized situation. It was still bearable in the realization that, yeah, these things exist, but, it's still a functional thing. Let's say, during my path, I've never seen that a morally polluted environment where, like, you're brought forward just because of identity policy, race, gender, all this, that bullshit. Absolutely not. And in fact, I'm also proud of that, because I think to come from a morally superior background in that sense, not just because of my beliefs, but literally because I've gone through institutions that are not polluted with this abomination of the dignity of mankind, right? And so you can be legitimately proud of that as well, if you want. But I also saw, and I also had to cope with that in some measure. So this happened before the doctoral the doctoral path. But when you realize that you get in your PhD program with other colleagues from other faculty, fortunately not my specific department of medieval history, and or mostly historians are much less politically ideologized, especially when you talk about the Middle Ages and so on. But I found a bunch of people there that were overt communists, right? And that, frankly, like, one guy especially was totally nice, right? He was a person I met also randomly once. I don't know how it happened. I was in the country. I met this guy who was going with a girlfriend by car. He stopped and say, "Oh, what are you doing here?" Like, and sometimes we went out for dinner with colleagues. Nice person, but you say, how can you be a communist, like in 2021? And okay, it happens in the complexity of the world. These things can happen. You're not a horrible monster in a sense, but there are certain standards there that should be explained. And normally, he never pushed his, ideology on me, nor in that sense, I had to complain for anything. But I just knew that, and these people do exist, and as much as we would dislike it, exists. So, but that's part of life. Unfortunately enough, if it just stopped to this, it would be a lot. Unfortunately, reality is not just that. And I would say, so bureaucracy, and so and it takes a lot of years to even get, like, if you're in for example, the wage. I know that the best you can get at the end of the career is like, at least here, it's like 4,000 euros a month, right? It's not even an enormity, but at that point you're an old person essentially. So all the way through, it's a decent job, absolutely. But it's also made of so much of this other bureaucratic stuff that even as a student there, as a researcher, I saw that is incredibly frustrating. It's probably the worst thing you can get into, and this professor exhausts. You always find a professor that has to do this for free in a sense, because he has to organize the PhD, and sometimes they are the PhD programs and all these things, and they do it just for free because the department eventually receives money on the base for the scholarship on the base of the such productivity, as they call it. It's all a bureaucratic kind of Soviet style, let's say, engineering and all these things. But I've stayed enough out. Like, I will not talk about that because I don't know how it works. It's much worse than it sounds. Probably when you get into it, of course, you know how to manage it at some point. But it's just, I have not been there myself. I've been aside it, I've seen it, but I haven't lived it as a perspective. I'm too young. I haven't done that, right? So I will be telling you just what I've seen getting to the doctoral title, right? And that's it, which is naturally very important. In this series, we will talk about how do you write something decent in that field. What are literally scientific problems in the research? What are you in for, right? And how you have to behave, you have to handle the moral situation, both in literally from terms of pressure and intellectual and commitment and all these things. Because eventually what you write and what you will keep writing, hopefully, will be essentially informed and determined and influenced by this. So the purpose of education is always to provide you not much with the flesh, like of the pulp of what eventually you're going to fill in yourself, but let's say with a skeleton, which is fundamentally a structure, a method, right? And that's what it is supposed to be. I must say that I've always felt very much let's say, the approximation in this path. That is to say, I can't say where I come from specifically, but I can assure you that the place where I studied is very and kind of absolutely highly ranked in Europe for what I do. So in theory, I've studied literally in the best environment and for my topic and so on, and has been recognized exactly in the year which I got the title, and so I must say I have some reminiscence of I can't say chauvinism, but let's say at least there's so many things that do not work in here. At least objectively, there is a dynamic there that makes things work. Sadly enough, not because education is this great deal there, but exactly because the dynamics of pressure bring paradoxically to our elite to be real elite worldwide. And even though maybe at the lower level education is apparently also shortcoming, there are, at some point maybe I shall make a video on properly explaining how the quality of education is ranked worldwide, because you may be surprised of how easy it is to trick about certain things or not. I think I don't know enough, but I've seen people visiting from very prestigious institutions and said they were surprised by what we did, right? And I personally say, like, I know I've been working hard, but let's say I've not been particularly surprised by what we were doing. So part of the reason also why I complained so much about the lack of quality in the commitment, all these things, is that objectively I think that it's not because there is a superiority here, but rather an inferiority there, and the reasons are relative, you may argue, in this sense, but not quite so much if you evaluate this on the absolute civilizational fluctuations and the broader history of culture of our communities and how things work in the West and so on. But this is a wholly different thing. And I don't remember the point I was making, but that, anyhow, that this, of course, path is something that is going to influence what eventually will be written, will go out there in the world, right? At some point, like it's like, I don't know, when you become a doctor, you're factually provided with the license to kill people, right? Because that's factually what it is. And so with history, we are actually provided with the license to fool people in a sense, or to at least to say things that of course others are going to listen and are going to receive from us, and which is our responsibility. I'm personally coming, my father wanted me to become a doctor like him, but only if I had gone in the Navy, because it says, in the military fundamentally it's easier than in civilian life, you get a better employment and so on, but don't become a doctor in civilian environment because it's not really particularly worth, at least here. And I agree with him, because again, even there it's mostly public, and it's become horrifying. Like before, doctors were actually respected and respectable people. Today it's not really the case with any other professional out there, including historians, so it's completely the thing. But what I mean is that I don't know, I personally feel the fact that if I write something, there is a laziness, in a difficulty. This is exactly, in fact, what I was talking about how much are you fitting the standards, right? You think that I made it to this point, that there is who knows what here. There is a lot of work, yes, but a lot of work doesn't often mean just very good work, for example, or particularly tremendous skills. In my path, I must say that every time I arrived at the end of it, I felt as if I had topped it. Like, not in terms of the best mark necessarily, because I've never been like that, even though, yes, I've always quite gotten the best, but it's even there, it's almost as if it were a formality, because even every professor has a different criterion of evaluation, right? So we should get acquainted properly to these parameters, because we give too much for granted, but we see it in real life. It's a bit like, it's very different from school, but still, what I care to say is that, I don't know, at the end of my master degree, I realized that the very last exam I made, and there I got the best mind. I had become kind of the model student for the professor, because I hardly ever been in principle, right? I realized that exam was the last exam I made was the perfect one. That is to say, from the beginning, those 5 years, I had managed at that point, finishing it, discussing my thesis, and eventually entering at that same point in the doctoral research. That's where I had to be, because I had literally learned how to do that thing well, and really well, after all that time. And so I measured that growth. I measured the fact that at the beginning, of course, I didn't know what to do. If I had to tell you what it was like my first experience while the first year, because, I studied like 6 months of economics at some point. Like, my examinations were ridiculous. Like, literally, I said nothing at some point. It was, you're embarrassed. I mean, I'm not easily embarrassed, let's say, in general, and I knew I was going there just for that outcome. But I literally didn't know where to begin. Like, that naturally, eventually, I abandoned that with the study of history. It was different because I had a completely different approach. Economics was even interesting. It just was not for me, and I learned some things there. And curiously enough, the best results I had there were maths, because even though I had kind of struggled with it in high school, at least I was provided with, even there, at the end of the day, I knew how to make it, right? It was very, at some point, it appeared to be very easy, right? For where others had problems. So it's always very relative what you're good at, what you can make, but there is also, in theory, a standard for which that is what institutions, educational systems should provide you with. That eventually, like the doctoral title, should be also recognized as such universally, worldwide, right? Because it's a universal language if you're a PhD in the world now. Right? So motivation here, of course, first and foremost, is about career, I presume, for most people. It's about getting a good title with, by the way, in the meanwhile, you are literally a researcher, right? In those years, I figured as if I were working for my university. You receive a scholarship. And so many people did it also exactly for that reason, in a sense, because they say, this is money, right? People just after money. If you're particularly hungry for money, I've seen that chances are that you tend to put that, in fact, in the first, it's your first objective, right? And then the quality of the research comes later. If you instead, like, you don't have problems under that ground, and what you're really interested in is the research, because you're curious, because you really have a point. You want to discover what one thing is independently from everything, right? And I found among my colleagues people that reason in the same way. I found a guy who just did it for free, for example, till the end, because exactly the year I entered, they had cut essentially in half the number of students, because they had before that were like a half they had the scholarship, a half they didn't, and it turned out that they had that those who didn't get the scholarship decided, okay, I begin the PhD, but eventually they wouldn't do anything because maybe they were working in the meanwhile or doing other things, and eventually they abandoned the program. And so this was all work for the professors to assist them eventually to do nothing. So they decided to cut that out. But there were some actually good driven people, like I met, that literally they wanted to make the research because they wanted the title and they cared about the topic. And there was a guy there that did it all those years completely for free and wrote also very good thesis, by the way, and was like a hero, right, for among in the group there, because literally you don't have even here to give for granted the ethical dimension of the same. All my life all I've seen in education is that those who really are interested in the science of it are the ones who make the best products. Those who are interested in the money are those that are going to make the bad product, right? And it may seem strange because you know that I'm a capitalist. I'm perfectly fine for doing things for money, but there is also a mechanism that can't be based just on the market per se, right? On at another level, personally, I leave it like this because I also personally would have done it without the money, right? If I had it happened to me like with that guy, I would have done the same because I wanted the title. I didn't want the money at the moment because fortunately I never had to hear about such things, and so I feel privileged, and I'm proud to be privileged, because you should absolutely be proud to be privileged and not to be ashamed. And for that very reason, however, you should be up to the standards that you're required. And it turns out that in this sense, people who are more privileged make it, not just because they have the means. They make it because most of the times they have an ulterior motive that is concretely the scientific one that is required in order to make it. And this is proven in my experience, and I think I can also, embody that by a certain standard. And this is a very difficult thing to say in today's times, where it seems like that for the left, if you you should be granted everything if you don't have means, for some reason we don't know, including success per se. If you are a conservative, it's mostly like, you should do it just for the money, and you should even not care very much about, I don't know, humanistic things. But this is absolutely disgusting, in my opinion. I'm for elite conservatism, as it was in true conservatism in a historical sense. Before the elite was real elite, they had superior moral standards because they had also more material means, indeed, but they were the ones who eventually were at the top because they were factually the best that civilization could provide, right? And being a conservative up to a few generations ago was to be highly educated, and to be highly educated in both humanistic and even preferably, in a sense, subjects, and in scientific ones at the same time, right? These classist or kind of ideological divisions have fundamentally no value for the worth of the dignity of humanity, right? They are a form of barbarism. They belong to an inferior reality, and we should completely get rid of them and literally eradicate them from our community. And that's the same reason. It's a bit the same reason why I make videos in here. Like, nobody would see why this has any sense at this point. Well, I do, because I have my own beliefs and ideas, and nobody's going to like, I can't change them, of course, but if at this point I also went through that far, it's not because of a delusion, but it's because evidently I have a point, and I care about that. So that's also what a motivation fundamentally is, to be true to your own ideals. Because if you start making it just a matter of career, unavoidably you're subordinating that to the career, even conceptually, even mentally. Maybe you make an astonishing work anyway, right? Or you make good enough, or the medium standard that works, right? But at the same time, it's a different view. All right, and I'm not habituated to this, and this has to do with my background. I did know ever since an early age, because my parents inculcated this in me, and I'm very thankful for that I would have had to work, right? That life is about being honest, is about having a family, is about working hard, right, and maintaining this and going on, because that's effectively the sap of civilization, right? That you can fail in these things. There are certain moments you can make a mistake, you can fail, you can feel down for some reason. Well, if there are problems, of course there should be somebody there who has to understand you. You can't be a cruel imposer in this sense. And that's why family and the community in general, and also the state by a certain margin, right, shall help you, right? And that's obvious, right? But you are the one that is going to be always in charge of yourself, right? You are the one who, first and foremost, if anything, because you're yourself all along, right? So you cannot escape from that, and other people do not fully know you the way you do, right? That you are the one who's going to make the thing. So whichever right, there are so many unpredictable things. You cannot know how your life is gonna be. During your educational path, you do not know where you're gonna end up. You do not know these experiences in the first place, right? So you can listen to this advice. You can inform yourself. You can ask people who've gotten there before in another but the truth is that until you don't make it yourself, you can you can't quite decide with reasonable certainty about what is that you want. So in many things in life, you just have to try, even if it is risky, right? You should always make sensible choices. You should never rush in things that really do not provide you with an evident, you know, an evident gain of some sort. You shouldn't be fooled by people who are just going to offer you something for free, because you know that it's not it's never for free, right? Nobody does things for free. And again, capitalism is fine, but you know you're still in charge of yourself. So you're not just a passive object getting to that, but you actually succeed in capitalism exactly if you are provided with an active positive quality for yourself, because that's what the world needs, right? And that only capitalism can provide you with, right? And it's something that without hard work there cannot really be a sensible path in this regard. So a PhD should provide you essentially with what's the purpose of the doctoral research in itself? Is it just to provide, like, is it just more work, or is there some qualitative character to it? Well, of course it's the latter, right? You know, if education works properly, the scientific process works properly, of course what you get through this path is an elevation of your understanding, right? It's not you just know more. As I was saying before, if you've never gone to university, studying history especially, because that's what we're talking about, you may not know how, for example, historical understanding actually develops over time. It's when you're younger, you think it's just about knowing everything, and so having kind of an horizontal knowledge you can space all around. The more you go on, you realize, first of all, you cannot know anything, but for real, meaning that, of course, also at the beginning, you knew you couldn't know anything, but you thought still you could know so freaking much, you should make a tremendous effort for that, and then you realize that even that much is not enough, right? So what you actually start doing through this path is realizing that there is what you have to do is not much getting more information in passively, but or learning it by heart, but essentially, and this partly the brain does for you, but you know, there is also properly a scientific method that is artificially instructed, and that's why there is compulsory education in civilization, and it's a positive thing. And that this method allows you essentially to frame whichever information you get better in a way that you can systematize your knowledge to have a higher overview of that horizontal level through the elevation on the base of these thoughts that literally make you rise higher through that understanding, right? So many things that, of course, we are eventually told by experts. Let's say in the media today there is the dumbification of the expertise, right? We are factually not told what's the actual science behind things. That there is a level of transparency that is actually there. It's just we're mostly bombarded with other negative models that do not really show you what's the reality of the story. It's like with current pandemic, right? What do you actually hear in the news? It's all about essentially a political debate, which is okay. It's what factually we should learn to approach science by, because it's mostly a political problem. It's always been the case, right? There is no please spit in the face of all those people who tell you you have to pay to do something because it's science, because this is just science and not politics, because a person who reasons like this doesn't know not just what politics, but what science is, right? And this is not to say that science is politicized in the evil sense, in the propagandistic sense. It's just that science is a method, and therefore, just like the motivation that we're searching here is a motivation that comes from human beings, from people that have a specific background, that have a specific bias, even if they don't want it, right? And so you shall always understand, in a scientific sense, what is that brought that information on the table, how, through which method, and so on. And that's essentially what we are taught to do as PhDs. That's exactly the point. I mean, it's getting to the level that you don't really have to trust an expertise, but you shall acquire your own expertise, and to therefore start playing God in a sense, at least in your very narrow field of expertise, where you actually start to dominate, because that's the point. You in your let's say in the topic of your doctoral research, you should be the person that in the world literally knows more than anybody else. And it is factually so. I measure it in my own thing. That is not maybe this enormous thing. It's essentially topping the military history, the tactical, the art of war of the armies of a specific country in 60 years of low medieval European history. You may say, can you build a bridge or a skyscraper? You know how to make a plane fly? No, well, I don't. I let the people who are competent for doing that doing it, right? But I know fairly enough, also because I confronted myself with the other experts on the field, that I factually know more than anybody else in that specific field for now. Then hopefully somebody will arrive, also because of what I have written, that he or she shall have learned in that manner, and will capitalize upon it, will expand it, and will get a better view than the one I wrote. But for now, like in the moment in which I achieved that result, I know and I measured and I have the specific understanding of why that is the case. I topped that specific topic. So it feels cool. I must tell you, like it's obviously one of those. You see, I'm a military historian specialized in Middle Ages, and I, of course, am not expert on anything that falls out of my doctoral research. Right. This is also kind of a humbling and even slightly depressing acknowledgement, meaning that, of course, this is. You cannot, you have a pretty concrete realization, and probably better than everybody when you get at that level, that of course of how much you do not know factually, right? All the videos that I make here on old medieval warfare, like I do because they are at a level of of understanding that I matured in general about certain things, but it's just in certain specific fields that I can't tell you for sure that something is in the way I do. So of course, keeping general is a good way, especially if you get the general basics, which many scientists at this point do not actually get. And I can tell you because I studied very carefully my manuals at the beginning of my, in the first year of university. Lots of kids there didn't. Right, and I personally think that that having expanded and having maintained, as I show in Schwerpunkt, this interest on a broader picture has actually endowed me with a much more, a greater capacity to contextualize correctly and as objectively as I can certain specific dynamics in their own respective context. Right, because that's what I'm honestly proud of at this point. Right, I can't say I'm better than others at doing it. It's just that I'm one of the very few people, if at some levels, about certain specific things of it, possibly the only person I know myself to do this, to not remaining sclerotized literally to my doctoral research topic. That is what factually most scholars out there, most professors out there are literally what they are, right? And this is alarming, and I could give you the dimension. I already made many examples at some point of literally what this means. It is how narrow that view is, and this is a bit, I think, the great evil of our times in science, that we have increased dramatically, of course, our instruments, our methods, and so on, but that we have abandoned the most important thing in the process, that is to say, to create people who are able to put things together and therefore elaborate in this enormous capacity of our brain. It is the synthesis capacity. No calculator, no computer, no technology that we currently have is even remotely possibly able to achieve. And this has nothing to do with artificial intelligence. There should be and even the accomplishments that are in that field that are very often misunderstood in terms of what it means comparatively, right? And I know better because I came across this through the Clausewitzian studies, right? That people still fall into the delusion that they can sort things out just through technology. It's not like that, right? It doesn't work like that. But it's never supposed to work like that because technology has always been there. It's our approach to it that has changed, and it has changed dramatically for the negative side. Technology is amazing, right? You just have to know what it is and why it is there and how it should be used and for what purpose, right? Not just thinking that it's technology, because factually, they people who have that kind of idol in mind do not realize that they're talking about something that is not even alive, that doesn't have literally and it cannot act by itself. Everything that you program, even to do autonomous, that doesn't actually exceed that setting that you have given to it, right? So it's only an illusion, and a pretty dangerous one, in my opinion. But we should make some other consideration at another point on artificial intelligence, because otherwise here sounds just like my usual rants. In any case, what I was saying is that motivation can be the most diverse. I personally was, as I said, always on that track. Like I knew that ever since I was little, that I had to work, that I had to study and to work, and so I wouldn't even question that. Not because I was imposed that. Of course, when you're in school, like, you're kind of imposed because children are sent to school, but I was glad to go to school, like most of my my mates. So it was it was fine. Then when I was still in school, especially in high school, I began to realize how important it was for me to learn, literally by myself, even aside from school, how to improve it like that. And at that point, I had realized that, of course, further education, university, and higher ambitions with profession, so are all connected to this attitude and to this continuous self-development. So I got it, I knew it, and the only problem was getting there, right? So succeeding, and I can tell you it was not easy, right? It was, it actually was much easier than I thought, but it's exactly that drive that makes you eventually think so. Because again, if you have always seen, I don't know, from my background, I don't think that abroad is very different, but the average attitude of a student saying, like, this is boring, I'm doing it just because, I don't know, I get that sheet of paper that tells I have a degree, and then I'm out of here, right? What I actually complain about, as most kids, and I remember I was even fueling the animosity of the crowds in front of professors, is that we weren't learning shit most of the times. Like the fact that we were being taught certain things that we fundamentally didn't care anything about, and not because we wanted the revolution or other things, but because actually we wanted to learn something factual about, very concrete about things. In my case, military history, so surely, I don't lean towards that direction. I have a pretty authoritarian, disciplinarian view of the world at this point, that I matured also thanks to scientific education proper, and that I reinforce quite vigorously exactly on that behalf from a moral point of view. And especially my subjects like mine, like history, if you don't learn by yourself, if you're not taught, if you don't understand by yourself at some point, and by the time you finish school you should have already done it, that you should learn by yourself most of the things that you really need, well, you really can't go anywhere, right? You can't declare yourself a historian just because you have a bachelor or master degree, and then you say, I don't touch a history book in all my life, right? That's just a joke, right? You distracted yourself for some year, you had fun, you went to university, you hit on checks, that's it, right? And then you started doing something else that maybe you didn't, maybe you cared even more than history about, right? But hopefully for you. But that's not being a historian. Being a historian in this sense, if you're really committed to the cause, and of course you should have the possibilities, because not all people have the possibilities to go through so many years of studying, because they need to work, right? And that's a very serious thing, and I have the utmost respect for the people I've seen, especially who were working and studying and making it, right? Those were the best, and I know that they would have actually not gone on with the things like a doctoral research and so on, but I esteemed them because they had a great resistance that I personally would have not had, right? Working and studying for me would have been factually not, and most of the people, in fact, that I saw doing it were not really doing great, right? Because either their job sucked or their marks sucked, or both most of the times. So the truth is that you have to be also very clear about what you want at which point, with which expectations, and of course that is what makes your own motivation, what makes you go on like that. Again, I had all the most favorable things from my side. I didn't have to work. I was supported. I all privately. So these are things that eventually reflect on me because I've been paying for that in a sense within my family, within my means, etc. So I haven't weighed on anybody, right? I pay already way more taxes than most people. So I think that what I owed to the community in a moral sense I already give, even if I'm not happy with how the money that I give is spent, frankly. And therefore, my mindset was also very aggressive for that matter. I'm actually a very ambitious person, even if I don't sound very much like that, because I don't know, I have a drive for that. I'm frankly an aggressive person, and not that I have ever beaten factually anybody, but I have a kind of mindset that is not very compassionate, that thinks that, again, you're in charge of yourself, and you are the one who has to perform well, right? And I don't tolerate people who don't, right? And that get in other people's way. That I really don't. In fact, I never had to, let's say, I never seen anybody passing in front of me, for that matter, because they were being brought in without having deserved it or something. It's just that I've never tolerated even, impoliteness, rudeness, stupidity, all these kind of things that for me make a person frankly inferior. There's nothing that I can do for this. I really have a very harsh way of judging others because essentially I demand a lot from myself too. So I think I'm stern but fair. And even though I'm surely am self-indulgent by some degree, I think that part of the reason why I was motivated enough is that I just needed to do it, right? I've never been one of those people who, and needed to do it meaning to achieve it, right? I've never been like those people who says, well, the important is having believed in it. Not really. The important is really to succeed, right? And to achieve something. And unless it's something particularly difficult, where it's practically very, very, very common to fail, well, I must tell you, the quality standards of my, of the criteria evaluation and so on weren't dramatically harsh, so that it was so difficult to get. And you just had to really work a lot, right? And not really that much. That is to say, even if you're not a particularly intelligent person, like if you study a lot, seriously, you can do it. So before, as far as I know from other people that went in there, like before you really had to struggle extremely hard, right? It wasn't about just working a lot. It was about being intelligent enough to get through the thing because you deserved it because of your intelligence. Today is hardly the case. Today, the evaluation standards have sunk because the massification of society has dramatically lowered the standards, right? So this is a pity because factually, very good institutions and even countries in general had to lower the standards just because they opened education to groups that before weren't allowed to. And I personally am in favor of that. What I'm not in favor of is the lowering of the standards, for that matter. I believe honestly that even if this would naturally bring some difficulties at some levels for many people, still the benefit that we could get since school from hiring the standards of evaluation would be enormous, right? It's not that we have to say to people like you're dumb, therefore you can't pass. But if you really don't even make the effort, because most people are intelligent, right? We are all intelligent, unless you have some serious mental problem. Like I don't believe that it's hard to get through such things, right? It can be, meaning it should be, but it's not hard in the serious way. Hard in the way that you're suffering, you're being dehumanized or exploited, or that it's unfair and just no. You just have to work a lot. How do you think things are made? How they are earned? How they're factually gotten? It's like even with the scholarship that I received. I frankly think every day that even though I kind of deserved to get my title in the end because it was an interesting thing that I wrote. And others believe the same, so it was not just narcissism. Even I'm not a narcissist really, but I like at least to feel good about myself sometimes, because otherwise you will kill yourself at any problem. The money I received, I'm not entirely sure whether I factually earned it in terms of real economy, right? I'm very stern but fair at the same time about my own money that I got in my pocket, and that I'm using for what I think I can improve myself. So that's why I also see in theory that I deserve. In this sense, I deserve in the real world, but in terms of more hardly real economy, to say, have I really earned those money for what I wrote? I don't think so. And I was one that actually wrote even much more than the others, and hopefully sensible stuff. So I don't really think that spending 3 years being given several tens of thousands of euros just for writing 200 pages of work is actually worth it, right? I don't believe it. Knowing, the kind of standards that eventually are at this point in doctoral research, I don't think so, right? I like the people who wrote these things, I like their work, but that's not worth the money, that public money of being paid for getting that. And I'm very, I need to point this out again, because I cannot see, in terms of standard evaluation, even a person that I like a friend, like a colleague, etc. That I remember the first year of university is I was there like a witness to the examination, is asked first exam of medieval history to tell anything, like literally either a date or what happened or where it happened, anything about the first three crusades, medieval history, and saying nothing and passing even with a good mark, because you say what this person just has about. It's not a good thing. It's not a moral thing. It's not a just thing. It's not correct, right? It's simply properly giving a negative example that lowers the standards further, that make people becoming ever more self-indulgent and nothing else, right? And those were places where you're even asked to do something. I know lots of people from in other places, in other contexts, that literally do not study anything, or they think they're studying something. Like there are some places where education is a joke, let's be honest, mostly for reasons either, I don't know, maybe there are places where labor force is needed, and so they need to have younger work, but those people learn literally less. Like, you realize that they don't know anything, they're not formed, they do not have an ethics, they don't understand what they do eventually, because still they are poor, because of course the situation there sucks, they bail out, and so they don't even factually keep learning, and they are losing purpose, they're losing capacity, right? If you don't study hard in your youth, fundamentally you're a less capable individual. There is nothing to do about that. Intelligence is something cultivated. It's not you're born intelligent. It doesn't work like that. Everybody knows it, right? There is another form. There are various forms of intelligence, of course, and there are ways, of course, you can become, a millionaire without any special talent. There are so many examples, but we know perfectly well that those examples are exceptions. So even if you are literally an intelligent person, you should get into things that are remunerative, because they are qualitative in nature. And if these standards sink in this field, that's not a good thing. But it's not a good thing also to bail out completely, because the world is not perfect, and that much we know very well. But this doesn't mean that also everything in this sense sucks, right? I'm disgusted again to see how a certain type of conservatism, especially in certain parts of the West, is about, now you shouldn't care about formal education. The important is just, getting into your business, and maybe, if you have to study just, scientific stuff because, humanities are all, maybe, yeah, they're monopolized by Marxists or whatever. No, I don't believe it is the case. I believe it's wrong. And even if, first of all, you shouldn't. First of all, there are still institutions that work in such fields. And even if there were such ideological problems around, which there are, indeed, you should struggle to form something on yourself on your own at the same time, right? Which, however, we need an institution to provide you the discipline to get the good standard for, right? You cannot really say, okay, then I will compensate for my lack of studying, a formal studying and something just by reading books. No, unfortunately, it doesn't work like that, right? You can become surely a more developed person, etc. But that process, that pressure, that criterion says, even if it's that low as the one I witnessed at some levels, for some people it may be high. Again, look at the quality standards that, I was saying before. This isn't theory the best place where we could study those things. Well, the fact that you have to go there in front of your colleagues, in front of a professor, etc., and expose the lessons during the examination, etc., it's something that gives you, first of all, it's coercive, right? We need more coercion in our world, especially in terms of scientific standards, because again, it's a passive coercion. It's to say, if you don't get there yourself, you cannot pass, right? And think about this, you are evidently under pressure. You should be under pressure. You cannot be educated without pressure. Right, what has come up with education? This idea that, for example, homework is bad, right? It shouldn't be homework. Kids should be left free to do whatever the fuck they want. Yes, you should, because a kid knows what he has or she has to do to become an adult. They have no idea. That's why they're kids. That's why they can't vote. That's why they have some limitations. And the only reason why they show you that, look, there are these countries that do so well with education because, they have less homework, right? They study less, so they do smart things, right? And so look at what the guy, here they immediately are inserted in the job market. The only truth of that thing is that they're stratifying and radically discriminating, right, between those that for some reason succeed, even with a poor education, because that is a poor education, because without a shitload of homework, you go nowhere in your life, right? In order to be an educated person, you should spit blood, right? And on both theory and practice for an astonishing amount of years. And you should be forced to do that for the sake of the goodness of human civilization. And what these people actually do is that, of course, they fit the job market. Or you create desperate people with no skill that you can exploit in every kind of shitty work elsewhere you would have to call immigrants from underdeveloped countries to do. And okay, yes, they are your citizens. That you have, but that's not a good education. That actually sucks. And if you talk to those people, they're just plainly dumb. You realize, because they have been schooled in those countries, and there is nothing to be proud of that. So also measure the actual accomplishments, because what you think is an accomplishment, you have to examine it scientifically, right? Most educational, like literacy standards, for example, in the world today, do you know how they are measured? They're basically, there are questions like, what do you think is the first cause of, of death in the world, as a disease, etc. This kind of also mostly concretely scientifically oriented thing. There are countries that do not have that kind of, where a kid may not know to answer that, and that's kind of bad in general, right? But given the standards of kids today, like, you can't even say that a kid that doesn't know that actually is not maybe, a person who has, I don't know, a good knowledge in literature, or that has a specific interest in another field, right? Or there are countries historically that are, for example, more scientifically biased and more humanistic biased. Right, there are big differences, right? Protestants and Catholics, for example, in Europe mostly remain on those standards. So if you have, for example, a dominant culture that measures others in a way that is, in this sense, very partisan, and says, okay, the other fails at that because these are the only things on the basis of which we evaluate it, right? And you know that I'm not a moral relativist. I believe there are some kind of universal standards here. Well, those standards should be about a complete, comprehensive understanding of reality, not just yes or no questions or true or false, or this dichotomic, because it's stupid. Like, it's like personality test types. It's just pseudoscience. It doesn't mean anything. But people like to believe that because they have, again, lowered their intellective standards to a kind of oversimplification that perfectly reflects what is happening in the academy now, that for which everybody is hyper expert in their own field, but they know nothing about the rest. So they're not mature, developed, cultivated human beings, because they fundamentally do not even understand what they discover actually means, right? And I would tell you that history by itself is one of those subjects that forces you more than any other to acknowledge such complexity, right? Because you don't have just a laboratory experiment, then you get a number true, and maybe the calculation is complex, but at the end of the day, you let somebody else think about what that means or how it can be applied. In a thing like history, you literally do not have a base, and so you have to make your mind create some patterns of interpretation that have to correspond and match. And of course, your work is evaluated, and there is some kind of exercise there. You can't really teach. It's what we were saying before. It's just the practice that makes the expertise, and this is why we are so confused about education in a sense, because sometimes we don't realize what. Of course, if you have not been through the thing, you don't know what's the difference of the outcome, right? You cannot explain to somebody within a bachelor degree effectively what it's a master, or effectively what it's a PhD. They may, again, know and understand it at some levels, but again, it's completely different whether they pass through the thing and eventually get there, right? Of course, as I was saying at the beginning, individual experience varies, but these standards that we set are universal in the measure in which the difficulty increases, right? Because mathematics is a universal language. So the greater the complex that you the system, the more complex the system you have to sort out, and the greater your human universal capacity of framing complex thinking, whichever it is, right? So those are the standards that we should elevate, right? We shouldn't absolutely lower those standards, because frankly, I tell you, I'm very impressed, for example, of how, in spite of the teaching, actually how, it's not even that bad in itself, but compared to the actual high school programs, right? If you had read, I should show you some point, my high school programs, right? If a kid actually knew everything that it was told we should have studied in those years, people would have essentially a PhD at 18, right? Of course, it's unattainable, but that's exactly the point. Like, you could push people to a limit for which they would eventually, especially at that age where the brain is like a sponge, they would learn an enormity of things. And at the same time, it's ridiculous to pretend that a person of that age, again, without any specific mental problem, should have difficulties to actually understand such topics, right? What is really crucial are the first years, are the ones of middle school, right? Because there you have children who are becoming adults in a sense, and so it's rough, right? And they may have difficulties to understand maths, to understand history, to understand how they have to learn, right? I think in primary school, children should be, first of all, they should be trained to learn things by heart, to get properly habituated to the value of authority, of discipline, of behavior, and to properly know how to become recipients of knowledge, right? So having the context, and even not squeezing them more than much. I mean, you can make them draw, you can do things that, of course, kind of have to leave space for their own creativity and all these things. But at the same time, you have to order them in a way that everybody can participate in the same way and also profit from being company of others and so on. By middle school, you have really to make them learn things hard for the first time, right? And that's a phase of your life where you learn things hard just by default, right? in which you toughen up, in which you're molded in a sense in the young adult that you're becoming, right? Those are moments where literally the teacher should be next to the kid and saying, look, if you don't understand here, tell me what it is, right? That is it, you have this difficulty, this problem. Most professors do not give a shit about that. Okay, they may have overcrowded classes, they can't be after every kid, but that's also why we should care much more education in other terms. But that should be the moment where really maybe there is a problem when you can say this person may have literally maybe a cognitive problem, a disturb, because kids are intelligent, right? You know, there may be difficulties at some level. Maybe there's something wrong at home. Maybe they are not confident in themselves. They have some emotional barrier, all things, but they're not stupid, right? And you don't have to be indulgent with them to make them believe, oh, you can't learn this, oh, poor dear. You know, there are different ways, the world could be seen. No. Science tells us that fundamentally there is just one way, and that the greatest struggle that we should make as a civilization is trying to understand what that way is, even though we can never fully reach it. So we have perfectly very good standards. You cannot be a moral relativist on a middle school program, right? So after that difficult moment where you hopefully have gotten the kids, you know, understanding everything, by your full teenage, there is no excuse. Like, if you don't study, it's just because you're a lazy animal, doesn't do anything all the day long, right? And that's the only truth that exists here in the picture, right? Because all what you see factually in school at all times is the following: kids, spoiled kids, doing nothing in their own life, wasting their time, not studying anything, not learning anything, and having professors just indulging them because they don't want to argue with their parents. And that's the only truth that exists. So if that kid at that point fails, it's their fucking problem, right? And if they're going to become underpaid individuals with nothing to live for because they just haven't been able to develop themselves, that's their fault, and they should pay for it, because we need people also who have to fit that role in society. Of course, this is harsh, but I believe orientatively still better compared to what, you know, the extreme that is shifted towards today, right? When you really want to make people believe that only what they feel is important. Like, naturally speaking, when you learn things, you suffer, right? And there is a reason for that. So you cannot learn without struggle. You cannot learn without suffering. You cannot achieve anything without that. So I know that we live in a world where people are pretty stressed, and there are lots of problems in general, and that, of course, yes, you may try to tidy up your room and somebody comes and you know, disorder is, you know, in spite of your good intentions. But life is unfair, right? It cannot be perfect. We know that it's unfortunately so. And the only way to make it better is to maintain this kind of collective discipline and accomplishment and standards, right? So it's not by giving up everything, because otherwise you will fail, right? And you will fail not because necessarily you will not have where to sleep or what to eat. You will fail as a moral being, which is the worst kind of failure in a person's existence. That is to say, you basically don't live. You basically are damned to live as an empty individual that realizes perfectly his or her own incapacity and remains frustrated and angry at the world for no reason, right? That's the thing. And factually, especially in the West, in our situation, in our time, there's nobody at this point preventing us from succeeding with a reasonable effort required to us, of course, in education, right? I don't know any place, I don't know any school, any university, any country where this is actually a difficult thing. I can think of corruption, I can think of other things that you might not like, that are bad, but factually there is no systemic problem regarding you becoming a developed person. What people do not want to know today is that it's their own responsibility, they have to do it, and they have to earn it, right? Which is essentially that's the nature of humankind, lazy and coward, right? So, and that's why we invented things like discipline, like authority, because we have to spur people to become the better individuals that otherwise would never quite become, right? It's like, given that we talk about military history, what do you think that in the military there is something called discipline, Like, have you ever thought about that? Like, why is there in school, or why is there in any state, or in any community of some sort, a level of authority, of coercive force, right, of law enforcement? Because without that, you wouldn't naturally have it. You wouldn't naturally have an efficiency in the work, right? And the reason why the military is so harsh in that regard, and it's supposed to be, it's because, of course, that what they have to go through is the most hellish and unpredictable and pressuring reality that you can imagine, and therefore you cannot have weak people that do not have the nerves to remain under a bombardment or machine gun fire with bombs exploding all around and people killed and maimed and all these things. They necessarily have to be disciplined, because if you want to defend a country, at least you must impose this. Civilization is based on imposition, right? Largely, right? And then there is consensus at the same time. And this imposition shall come from the majority in a democratic fashion, and that's how we govern, right? And with flexible principles, with systems that obviously prevent abuse of power and all things, but such harshness is required. So if you need a way to motivate yourself regarding to these things, you have to think this, that you cannot complain about things that happen to you in life unless there is a specific reason that really steals you what you should have to succeed, that you can't do it, right? And even if you were in that situation, if you still can make it, and that's what you care about, if you want to really prove how much you care about, how credible you are in the eyes of everybody, is to actually do the damn thing, even when there is something difficult in between, right? And again, I could give you many examples, right? And life is not just about somebody stealing you something. It's about how you feel. It's about being heartbroken. It's about feeling sick. It's about a lot of things that nobody would like to experience, but they do exist, and very often there are also consequences of our same behavior. And again, it's unfair. Life is unfair, but we can make it fairer only if we maintain the standards to cope with that difficulty. Right? We know that there is a certain biological hardware that we cannot erase, for which there will always be, there will always be bullying, there will always be racism, there will always be injustice, all these things. But the only way to fix that is to higher the standards for everybody, not whining over the poor martyr that is actually just a parasite most of the times. So, especially in this day, because it turns out that when back in the day, things were really hard, but I mean really hard, not like today, and this is a factual reality in the history of mankind, people worked. They weren't there whining, because if they had been there whining, they would have starved to death, right? And that's what mankind can do. So at that point, you have no excuse whatsoever, right? And you should discipline yourself in order to attain what you want. That's the only truth. Then, that's why we have values. That's why we have communities. That's why we have families. That's why we have affections, and so on. Because we also help each other when we see that somebody's struggling. We should be next to each other. This is true, but you shouldn't think that that thing is there by default. Because in the moment in which you think that, you're just sinking the standards, and this is making the whole society, the whole world weaker in the process. Because you're just expecting fundamentally more to come to you for no reason, right? Instead, the only way to succeed is to work very, very, very hard, right? And the motivation for a doctoral degree in this sense is it passes through those things. I must say that I didn't know what concretely a doctorate was up until like I think it was in the last years of the bachelor degree, and then I got more interested during the master, eventually approaching as I entered immediately, and then the following year, to what that was. I basically started the PhD, I will tell you, without actually even knowing what it was, right? I just wrote a project, participated to selection. I knew, of course, I had an idea in mind of what I wanted to do, etc. I just didn't even know how I would have achieved it, right? I had a big idea that had to explain the project, but what that practically would mean, I would discover in the following 3 years of struggling for that matter, the system can be that ferocious, can be that fast and unforgiving in that for that matter. And but at the same time, yes, I think it should be done. Like if you think that your educational quality should improve, you should just go into it, just try, just to do it, right? It's not difficult in to do it, to let's say to try. It's difficult to succeed, maybe, but it's still worth doing it, right? So I discovered that at that point. I was glad I entered, and I realized that that was my new responsibility. Sometimes we have to be brought into things. We have to be pushed into things. We don't have to be refractory, and this I can tell you from a person that is very habitudinary, that loves the routine, doesn't like change, and that is not even so. I consider myself like a straightforward person, but I always think a lot about things before doing them, right? And at that point, it was better for me to get in because I already had decided it had to be the case. I just was very, like, I didn't think I would make it. You would be surprised to know that the prodromes of Schwerpunkt were born also in that specific situation, because I thought that it would have been quite unlikely to pass. And indeed, maths was against me, because I passed out of a number of 16 people after having found during the selection a friend of mine who was there, who was older than me, was trying for the third time to get in. And would fail at that point. He would get in just a year after. And by the way, he was an antiquist. He got into medieval history because he was desperate to just to become a PhD himself, even for things that he he hated, at least at the time. So it's something worth trying. Of course, there is a price in defeat also that I personally haven't witnessed in that field, and that I believe is also important to address, because again, for all the things I just said, you shouldn't think that if you fail, you are just less of a human being for that. It's normal to fail. Failure is the sap of scientific education. It may seem strange to you, but it's exactly the thing, because nobody makes you realize reality more than a failure, right? And so it can be frustrating, it can change your life for the worse, because that's exactly what a failure is. But at the same time, it can provide you with a knowledge that makes you reflect a bit more on the situation. There you shouldn't lose the motivation. Like if you really want to if you didn't want to try, if after all you have no other impediment to, and it's a profitable thing, you should try this experience, right? And I advise it to you in general. It's like this could be said for a degree in the first place, because you see, a doctorate. This is yet another motivation. A doctoral thesis is truly in your life the only meaningful thing that you may write you may have the opportunity to write with that level of quality. Say, of course, if you get it, you should eventually keep writing valuable stuff, right? But it's like a degree, a thesis in general. Those are often the only experiences you have to even write something serious in your life. Have you ever thought about that? Like, I've never thought it in these terms, but let's say you may wanna actually have had the satisfaction in your life of having written something that you truly cared about, that you wanted to investigate on, and that you wrote decently from a scientific standard that will remain there, will have helped you, will have made you grow, right? So definitely, doctoral research is the best to develop that kind of awareness about the world. Again, because it's not much something that you learn more, it's something that makes you understand more about the world, and in a scholar fashion, right? There is properly a dimensional factor in the story that is how much you manage to expand your own view on certain things that you would have never seen the same way, that you were aware were there, but that you didn't know how they really worked, why they were there, what was their meaning, and all these things. Now, other motivations could come from the fact that, doctor may be a kind of a cool title for different reasons, right? I never made anybody calling me like this so far. It's just 4 months. How much? I just don't care. I never cared. I thought it was ridiculous actually, especially before, because everybody calls doctor because I don't know. At least in our country, you get a degree. You have such the degrees suck. Let's be honest. In general, the as much as even the doctoral ones could for that level. So I've always found it kind of ridiculous, and I always told you frankly that I'm not here, especially well on YouTube. Of course, I don't talk to you as if I were, at university with somebody. I can't tell you that I managed to crack jokes, on violence and other stuff. But and people laugh, which is interesting. But anyhow, in human mind, there are just two things: emotions and symbols, right? So you're able, if you get people on those bases, you can't get them on everything in a sense. The this sense of status, is this a motivation? Like, do you want to be a doctor? Do you want to be somebody who says, you're a real doctor? Well, I don't know what to tell you. Of course, if you are like a young male who is, interested in, in scoring with the right girl and so on, well, that can help you in a way. Objectively, you deserve it because again, yes, I'll say it again and again, most PhDs are really unimpressive. But given that, yes, they are technically the only ones who got through that specific path. Yes, if they're unimpressive, also most people are unimpressive. Let's be honest. So that's yet a way of discriminating on such basis, and it can be like a motivation for me. Yeah, I guess so. I'm relatively proud about it but only when I actually have to get somebody I'm interested in. It's just that. Like, I like to be appreciated on that ground, but I honestly feel even a bit embarrassed to tell you here that now, yes, I make this serious, that I feel unconfident about it. But I just do it for the merit, and also because, frankly, sometimes I don't want to prepare the video with all the pictures, all the things. It's boring. But these are kind of interesting topics. Like, to this point, and especially considering how much we talked about the value of education and scientific culture and all these things, I presume it's important to talk about it as well. But for the rest, I don't see I don't go out or talk to people and say, what do you, I would say just maybe a historian. And yes, I would say I got a doctorate, but let's say I don't, because I want to, of course, put in the fact that I got there. So they know where I come from, and they maybe take me more seriously, because that's important. And say I want to test mostly the other person through the process. Like, if they are surprised and if they make me question, that's an interesting way, for example, to start a conversation, to say, what did you study, what you really, it happens, right? So it was here like from before. And honestly, I'll tell you this about the unfairness of life, that young males today do not have a great time in community. Ever since I was a kid, I always found a lot of people were kind of looking you from top down, metaphorically, at least in my case, that saying, this is just the young stupid boy, right? Because young boys are stupid. I never liked, because honestly, I've ever seen boys and girls being at least endowed with a potential, that eventually what they do with that potential is the other thing. Yes, I do know what it's disgusting when you see, kids that make a mess, that are noisy, and yeah, I hate them too. But at the same time, I kind of understand the fact that I was there at some point, and that maybe I improved as well at some level, that still at the time I didn't like that kind of thing, but that, yeah, when you're young, you're stupid. You're meant to be stupid, because otherwise you wouldn't understand things, because you still don't, frankly, but also because you wouldn't impact so hard against the reality for you to understand well, right? And that's exactly what happens. And so the idea of being I you see, I traded. I'll tell you this much, that I've traded in my life certain things that I liked for this path, right? And sometimes I regret it, not because not rationally, but emotionally, because I liked swimming, for example. I was even very well, predisposed for it. I practiced it for 12 years, and then I had effectively to abandon it seriously for this learning, because it's not just about, again, I meet people who pretend, again, that they get a degree, they keep making other things in the meanwhile, and then they get a job and they keep doing those things in the meanwhile. They think they're so accomplished and brain capable and powerful. And those people hardly excel in either of those fields. You say, but there's no need to excel. Yes, but again, if you don't point high, you can't even reach, again, that level of development that is necessary to look at things from a qualitative point of view. And I personally wouldn't like to be when I was like 10 years ago. Now, let's say I would never trade my own mind now rationally for that. But I realized that I missed that. I realized that I missed more interaction with people, more other things that, however, when I think about it rationally, I say, well, yes, but if you had spent time for those things, at this point you wouldn't be here. And where do you prefer to be? Right? And I try to picture where I would be here. Maybe, I don't know. In reality, I would be a billionaire, with my villa, enormous swimming pool, keep out of, and all this. But let's say, more concretely, knowing myself a bit, I think I would be fundamentally here still, but having done perhaps some more interesting things, maybe I would surely have something satisfactory going on still, but I suspect I would regret more than today. I would say, you see, I had the opportunity to become somebody better, not somebody in the same career again, because that was never clear, but I wasted it. And honestly, there were for that matter, there are other motivations that, and so and this have to do with the reasons why I traded those things for others. For example, the fact that that some of my family couldn't get a good education. And honestly, all those things I say, because I have, like, my father's families were really, they had, they were more than upper middle class. They were fine. They were really well. My mother's family wasn't, right? They were really poor, right? And this was a time where, of course, Europe was still growing, and so now, in fact, they are middle class, right? So they succeed. They made it on their own. But all those things I said about succeeding, even if you're poor, if you have problems, and so on, I know what that means. That is, I don't know it personally, but I know because I had an example in my family, more examples in my family, of people who didn't have almost anything, and that never, ever complained, but just worked like hell. They became better persons, but because they were honest. They had always been. Never been poor equates more diseased individual. Absolutely not. But that's exactly the proof of it. What happened? People who made it in life, because they always knew what was the value of honesty, of hard working, and never like trying to not to pay the rent or all those things. That's why I also developed a radically violent contempt towards anybody who is different from that, because I believe that that's literally an inferior person. Like, I believe that if humans are measurable in terms of superiority or inferiority, is a matter of what they behave like. And every time I meet people who do not meet those standards, to me, I can understand that they come from bad situations. But let's say still there is, in everything that is done wrongly, like a level of malice that you could have done better, and you haven't done better. Like, I still always think of how to do better all the time, even mostly being, I never had problems with the law. I didn't ever had this kind of dramatic situations where I had to choose between good and evil in terms of crime and both things like that. But I personally think it's always so important to do your best if you can. And even if you can't, do it, at least you should try, because you may never know until you do it, right? And still you will have accomplished something. People who don't believe like that, I hate, right? And so I owe this since an early age. Interestingly enough, also my father, that was, absolutely coming from a good, you would argue a privileged background. He also worked always very hard, right? So when there are principles, there's no way that things are going to work. When there are not principles, right? When you start letting people believe that, after all, doesn't matter how you are, it's good anyway, it's over. Like, entire civilization collapses completely. And the worst is that we have to pay for those who fail, right? And that's the worst thing, because technically I don't owe you anything if not some kind of human compassion that I may feel, and I do feel. Because I believe, especially when somebody is close, that if somebody fails, you should help that person. But you can't help everybody. You should help yourself if you want really to help everybody the best you can, right? So that's how I see it. So I like, especially history. It was something that my maternal grandfather was like a carpenter. Like, he had different jobs in his life. At some point, they lived also well before the war. That was that there were cases in life, let's say, but at this time, what my mother remembered him, he was a carpenter. He woke up, very early in the morning, spent all the day, he got some health problems. He would cough all night because of the powder or things. He was exhausted all the time. He was an absolutely modest man. He had been in the military. He had played musical instruments. He appreciated classical music, boxing, all these things. But one thing especially he would do, even if he was broken by his work, he was already ahead in his age, he would while coming home, he would always stop by the library, pick up a history book, and read it at home. And this is something that, considering the misery of the situation, the difficulties, the pain, because also that's the only grandparent I never met, because he died 4 years before I was born. My mother got actually the history thing from him, and I got the history thing from my mother, actually. And so I think of that, and I think of the sufferings, the pains. This had a tragic story. His parents had died in his when he was still a child. It's some very, very hard things. Those things that today still exist, of course, but that in the context of the time, also all the difficulties, the poverty, etc., we don't quite get the way we get it now. I think I have this possibility, I have this chance, while this person that I loved so much didn't, and that I owe life to, right? In all the miraculous ways you can know, in history can happen. And don't I owe to myself, rather, right, through this person, to be a better person, to make it, to be motivated for it. This was a great motivation of mine. This was one of the greatest motivations I could possibly have, possibly the greatest one. Possibly even if I haven't fully rationalized it when going through all of this, but every time I think of that background, looking at my mother, had a hard time in her youth, etc., because of these problems and so on. I say I owe it, right, to all the fatigue, to all the work, to all the hard work, and eventually brought me in to be educated myself, to be grown up by my parents, all these things, to be raised. You understand what I mean? Well, of course I have to do it. I would do it even if I were never asked, right? And I was never asked, as a matter of fact. I was just told that I would have to do it, and I would have had to choose factually what I would have liked. Like, when I was 18, 20, nobody would have told me, like, you have to do this, I impose it to you. No, I could do effectively whatever I want, and I chose to do this, right? So, and I don't know whether this is enough, whether this is, it's not, I don't even care, because the important is whether I go on or not, if I maintain it, if I show that this is my full devotion and faith and belief in reason, in righteousness, right? In logic, in what I believe this world is held by, and I think I have a responsibility to it. So I think that having this approach helped me dramatically, right? Even if maybe at the moment in which I started the research, I didn't know. Maybe even if I'm realizing certain things in life just right now regarding how important it is to have that specific kind of determination and of mix of acknowledgement and force. But I'm sure that within me these things always existed, right? At a subconscious level, emotional level. I would acknowledge them, of course, explicitly at some point. But those are the things that made me going, right? And it's hard because if I were asked to do it the same thing again, right? If I had the same energies, the same mindset of the time, of course I would do the same thing, but because I wouldn't know, right? And it's also the unknown that pushes you to do certain things. You may never know how it is. So to me, it was an important accomplishment for these things. Again, I don't care very much about the title in itself. As a matter of fact, I'm not even so eager to exploit it so aggressively for other things, because I'm still moving. I still have to understand how certain things work after the research. So it's not easy. It's yet another challenge, and such challenges never cease. There's never a moment at which you make it, and definitely being a PhD doesn't mean to have made it in life. It just means to have proven yourself that you can do certain things, that you know what's the value of them, and how much, in fact, they're worth for you to go on in other ways. In a ways, it's also challenging just to have done it, right? Not just to do it in the meanwhile, right? It's the fact of getting the burden of the awareness that you got through this path, which I can assure you it's growing, right? It's not easy. It's as if you increase, your responsibilities increased, and you were always more thoughtful about, yeah, I've done all this, but then what, right? I know this was hard, so what I expect to come after this is in theory even harder, right? It can be another level. It can be about having a family, can be about also negative side eventualities, all things that you may never know life will face you with or not, right? Some you must want them to get, and others you just know that will happen, but others are just unpredictable, and most of what is going to happen is unpredictable. So, and by far, right? So the motivation is not really thinking that at the beginning. You may think, of course, that it is a way of of social promotion, in a sense, that you can be better, can get some benefits from that. And yes, I believe that aside from the ideal, of course, having this base, the structure is important. It's a further, is a steadier ground to move from, and so to fall back in case things go wrong. So it can be, it's always useful, where in another, right? Even if you don't go on teaching at university, you can still say, okay, I have this title, I can do something more. I have a knowledge to spend, after all, right? There are things I tell you here, Schwerpunkt, that I learned during the way, not even doing that thing, but while doing that thing, and including the same Schwerpunkt, by the way, that allowed me to improve my same work there. So, as you understand, it's very complex, right? So the motivation is definitely the most important thing, right? If you're not willing to persevere, to go on, to exist, let's say, sometimes to even say, I hate this, right? Not that much about the research here in the specifics, but let's say all the path that is necessary to go through before accomplishing this. It can be frustrating. There were certain moments I even risked, literally, at many levels, in certain things, even not much, not yeah, also not making it, of course, but also in the between. I risked to get into a discussion with professors that would have not been quite pleasant. I risked for reasons that were absolutely non let's say non-serious in the let's say in fact I was risking stupidly for an act of arrogance fundamentally, but also of righteousness even in there, because there are ways and ways also to be right and to be wrong, depending on how you act accordingly. There are moments in which you can even literally risk your life. I can think of some times I was going to university with my motorcycle. I risked to I risk badly sometimes of some things happening to me, and again, that has nothing to do with it, but it's still part of what you have to do to get there, paradoxically. It is about, it's also about the difficulty of handling the standards. It's difficult, for example, to have gotten to this point and not feeling the necessity to explain things to other people, and maybe some people are not willing to listen to you, or maybe they take it as a form of arrogance again. But for example, it happened to me disastrously this year that I was told by the person I really wanted to have a future with, that according to her, I loved history more than her. Now, this crushed me. The thing ended badly, and I'm not over it. And part of the reason why this is happening, of course, it was a misunderstanding, because I can't truly say that, even though I made mistakes, relatively, nothing serious, but that I objectively didn't even behave as if I was ever trying to show or to impose or some my historical, but it came out like that, and it struck me. It still makes me suffer a lot, but there is obviously a part, in part it's real, that of course I want to explain certain things to somebody, and if that somebody may feel threatened, like as if that she was not enough, that I'm maybe to, like, I want to out. I don't even know what was the fear there, honestly, but it's how do you handle that, right? It's so painful that sometimes you even wonder whether it was all worth it. And I think I do think it is worth it. Like, rationally speaking, part of the reason why you do this is that also you acquire, like, true pressure and resistance and perils and all these things. You start understanding what's the right way to act, to behave. I would say what happened in the last years, maybe also for these other experiences, even maybe for Schwerpunkt, for the fact I commented from Clausewitz, as you know, that I'm so fixated with, at some levels, or healthy. It's never enough with von Clausewitz, but for a scientific reason, by the way. But I'm a much more determined person than I was before. This could be a motivation. It could be a motivation that even if you don't realize it, these years make you grow. These years make you get through things also in life that you put in relation to what you're doing, your work, etc. And you have to balance between one another. And this teaches you to understand what you want, but also how to want it, because we never really know what we want. We are mostly irrational beings who really act upon, do strange things. But let's say the scientific work of the research helps you realizing whether you are objective or not about reality. At least it makes you closer to a more concrete understanding of how certain things work and what the problems may be. So you become, in a sense, more intolerant, and it's definitely what I've become. Never think that knowing more makes you actually become more tolerant, right? The most prejudiced people are exactly the people who know the most, because they know exactly what to expect most of the times, and most of the times they're correct if they know well the thing. And so it's very difficult sometimes to cope with others at that point, because if the others don't see that, they're automatically, that depends on how they behave with you, right? And if it takes a lot of time, I guess, but some effort is useless. You cannot really pretend it as if it was the same experience. But I don't know. I would like, I would profit from that. Like, if I were in the same situation, albeit maybe here there are other dynamics, male and female, they're somewhat different, I presume. And yes, I don't care to be considered sexist for that matter, because it is a real thing, really. And in fact, I experienced it twice during this period. And so, given that, as you have understood, and as I even said at the beginning, these are very important things for me. Well, I can tell you that is, in a way, it's a very perplexing experience, right? It's even disappointing. It's disappointing in the measure in which, for example, they make you do certain things you really don't want during the research. Another thing we didn't. So you even may wonder whether it was worth it or not. But then you realize, in a sense, that as most things in life, it's never as it's supposed to be, right? You cannot say, I didn't like what happened in this research, in the didactic, in the relation with others, and so on. Hence, it was not worth it. Hence, I maybe should have not done it, because in that same moment, you damn know it was worth it, that you wanted it and you got it, right? So even if it came with those, together with those the evils and things that didn't really work, still you did it. And the reason, that's why you should understand what was the reason of it that went beyond those things. In life, it's always like that. You're always going to find that obstacle, unfortunately, and the best way you can cope with this is, in a sense, pushing forward through other obstacles, because the chances are that at that point, ever less obstacles will ever scare you or block you or be a problem for you. And it does cost, right? Yes, it does cost. And so in this video, again, I'm talking just about the motivation. So I'm not making practical examples of what literally, how things literally were. So we will talk about it in detail. We should talk about for example, the project, I would say, for sure, the selection, then how you plan the whole, how you start working, what the attitude should be towards this work, because we will enter exactly in the mechanism for which you have to encompass a multiple years research in a way that you have no idea how it's going to turn out. This is also the why it's so damn useful to do this thing, because it teaches you how to cope with, in fact, the unforeseen and the unforeseeable, right? And it shows you how you can succeed in things even when you would have maybe failed. You could have easily failed in the same way. This is also somewhat strange, because I guess in all these career things and competition, you say, important, as I just said, it's really succeeding in a way, right? Because yes, we can't be relativistic about this. The defeat is, shouldn't be an option if you're motivated, right? So when it happens again, it's not a tragedy, but it's useful always to understand that, even to spur you, that defeat is always behind the corner. I found people during this research who hadn't quite realized that, which for me was crazy, because I can argue that maybe my greatest worry throughout all this path was literally making it, right, in time, and in this sense, finding, at least, like everybody presumes, but at least finding the right way of doing it, because it was a problem within itself, right? Instead, I've met people who start these things and leave like in a very romantic ideal where they don't really realize that there is time running, and that they maybe don't do anything, they're wasting time, that they haven't even gotten their act together, and knowing what literally they have to do. I've been, you know, torturing myself about this. I've been really very, we'll see, there were some stages in which I believe I had to do something that I realized I had no idea of what it was, and eventually fixed the problem in something that, in a way that was, if you want, unpredictable up to a certain point, or that was there but I just hadn't noticed, and that it was still something random at the end of the day, that I was lucky enough to find the means to do this, and because otherwise I would have failed, and even badly. So I would have had a completely different experience about it, and naturally even the outcome influences the way I see the thing, and even the fact that I'm talking about it now. But still, in the way you succeeded, you realize that realizing that you could have failed by itself is really powerful, because it doesn't, again, it makes you closer to the truth in a way that is very bitter but real, and that therefore helps you for how things are gonna work in the future. Things are also much worse than you think later on, right? When you realize how few even these titles really are worth out there, how frustrating scientific the academic world really is by itself, how fictitious, how uninspiring it is, right? How like many things, they are disappointing, right? But if you succeed in these steps, at least you're not disappointed yourself. I think it's a good start for having the confidence in what you have to do next, and be aware of the issues. This comes a bit in all things, like in career. There are people who could rise, but sometimes they get the amount of pressure that they're not willing to take, and they stop there, right? You could earn more, but maybe it's too much for the emotional pressure, so they can always say, I stay here, right? And they get it, and they go on. I personally don't see, I've seen it mostly as I've never seen it as a literal career. Like, I know that things can improve, that I could at some point get to teach as a professor, which I hate, because frankly I believe that either you, like, if you teach, like, either you teach or you research, right? Doing both is doing both of them bad. I like a bit to teach, probably dispositionally. I just don't like people more than much, and I just don't want to teach people who don't really get or deserve, or they would deserve it always, I would say, but that they're willing to get interested in what I'm saying. Like, that is, I could never teach to high school kids what I do, at least on let's say for my academic level, because my idea is, I've said it that much. Why should I teach kids? Like, it could be a benefit to it, maybe for them, for others, but I should do things that somebody else could do, maybe even better than me. I have gotten I should be doing something else. So I don't think I should lower my standards, even if when it sounds arrogant, or maybe I don't like it to hear it from myself as well, because it sounds undeserving in a sense, contemptuous. But there is even there a point. Like, I want to talk about more complex things, and that's the reason why I also talk on Schwerpunkt, because here it's the only place where I can say whatever I want without having to face the cost, broadly meant to go somewhere, to have to worry about the audience, at least in a certain way. That is, talking in front of a crowd is different from talking in front of somebody listening, all in their own place, wherever you listen to these things from. There are other problems, but so far they're so low that I frankly they're virtually insignificant. So I'm fine with that, and I like what I do, evidently. But let's say I've seen this not really as a career in a linear sense, right? I've always seen these steps that we're saying, like securing a certain position, then moving to another position that is not obvious. It could bring you somewhere else that you may not really know or understand. So that is, you have to determine. I wish in a sense, I have much clearer ideas of what I want to do in my life than I appear to be. But in part, it's still exactly about assessing realistically the unknown that motivates you, makes you see. I want to make. I want there then to make happen what I want to make happen, not what I'm supposed to fit in by somebody else's standards. That I don't. I just by nature I don't never got and never bought. I never accepted. Right, and part of the reason why maybe I made it in this field it's because I've reasoned like that. In fact, a great part of this series will be probably dedicated to the aspect of how what I did was received by others. Those who had to evaluate me, those who had to, to follow me along the path, who had to eventually assess the nature of my work. That is quite fascinating because I've done my research actually, unlike basically any person that I know, without any support of any kind from anybody, first of all, and consequently not even from the experts in the field. My tutors even actually were not competent, minimally competent about my own field of expertise. Yes, there were medievalists. One especially was specialized in the, let's say, in the broader community was studying, but absolutely not about the military aspect. And therefore, I literally did all the work by myself without any kind of help, with everybody saying, but how are you going to make it? Like, there were maybe some problems of communications, even me explaining it. I felt I didn't even need to do it. And instead, I succeeded in a way that, in fact, surprised the others at the beginning, because I don't seem like a particularly, I don't sound, and at least in comparison to my colleagues, I must tell you, they're very, very advanced, very, very smart people. I don't seem to be that. So I'm always the kid of the situation in a sense. Even if I don't look like a kid, but intellectually, it's as if I were, maybe for this thing that I have towards warfare that is much more, even scientifically, not humanistically oriented, and that is something that is not studied, that people generally don't even conceive. So sometimes I feel a bit like an outcast, and it was the case, right? It is the case even in general, historiographically speaking. That is, I don't find basically anybody that does exactly what I do, the way I do it, and instead, and this is an attitude that this could help as a motivation. I always maintained throughout my whole work. All my theses I wrote because I wanted to write them. There was nobody imposing them to me. I never, literally, every time I sought for an advice, actually, I was dissatisfied with that. I did worse by following the advice. It would seem strange to you. You should always following kind of advice. I did, in a sense, but I'd never been told what to do. Right? I've never, like, unless, of course, these were experts in their own fields, of course, they would tell me. Like, there were some little theses I wrote that they had to do it in a certain way, of course. But the big the ones that I could choose completely freely, I couldn't find anybody who were really expert in those. Unfortunately, so I neither even searched for them expressly. I done all myself. I chose the topic. I chose it in things that also normally are not studied in my environment, my milieu, right? Properly from a historiographical point of view. For example, in my master thesis was not that great work, in my opinion, in the sense that I was essentially not adding anything new to what we already knew. I just interpreted the thing my own way, but more or less what the sources were, somebody had done already the work. I just said it my own way, but it was about a battle that in my country has never been written about. Even if it was one of the most important battles of the Middle Ages, at least most people truly in Europe don't even know it happened, but it really is, and that tells you also how, like, I never followed the stream of others. Like, I never said, there is all an historiographical trend, kind of almost etiquette, right? What are the kind of topics that you choose? Not the topic by itself, the kind of topic. That is to say, the fashion, the manner to which you approach a certain historiography. To me, it's all garbage. Like, if you want to know something, you define it, what it is. It can be all complex as you want it. You read all historiography, but you want to find out about that thing, even if it's a big thing. You have to find your own way. Instead, this kind of minimalistic anatomic surgery on minimal parts that eventually never recompact to the wall, this is the norm, right? I never cared of it. I've always found it boring. I never liked to do that, right? And it seems that I was right at not doing it, because I did something that I think it was better. And secondly, that objectively was really new and different, and that sets even a model, a trend, and that I discovered that basically had me make surpass in most, even the alleged experts in those specific fields, right? And it's not that difficult because at least in my own, there are very few people who are expert in anything. So, that's also another thing you have to consider. We will talk about how you choose a topic. That's going to be a hell of a video, because sometimes you even ask me how you do, but in a doctoral research, it's way worse, because you have to remain. I mean, it's way more interesting actually, but you have to remain with that for years, and of course you adjust it along the way. But still, it has to be the big question. Just recently, some of you asked, for an article, how do I define the objective of the research? Right? And that's crucial in a sense. It's not everything, because then you have to, that's just how you start. Then you have to build upon it, to capitalize upon the various things you come across during time. You have to adjust in that way. But at the same time, it's important also to have a concrete point that is not just something that you shouldn't even be sure it can't be demonstrated, but let's say that you may have that is objectively concrete where to be demonstrated. That is to say, sometimes it may not even be a problem by itself. It can be a question more than else. It can be, can we know this, for example, and or what was going on literally in this field? Because especially if nobody has ever written about it, you can be, and you should be lucky in that field, because that's exactly also what a bit the new fashion is, that in most historiographical branches, certain topics have been not truly exhausted, but let's say some veins are very, very prolific in a sense. And so just covering the entire historiography existing of such topics is nightmarish. And so people tend to research things that nobody even ever cared about. So even the strangest things, right? When we were brought in the first years, fortunately it was a pandemic in the third one, because we could never stood it, to meet the new colleagues, let's say, that had started that year, presented the research to us, their own research. You come across things that of course you don't give a damn about, but secondly, that because they're literally different subjects and so on, but how strange sometimes they are, and when you look at these people, you immediately understand whether, like, what they are mostly. Like that's terribly easy to do. How to spot a person's character through what they research about, and how to expose it, and they talk about it. It's so easy in a way, even politically, to see where if you choose that topic, and there is all a philosophy here that we can't address. We'll talk about it in the respective video. But I'm glad I started with the motivational thing, because I didn't know how. I'm surely missed some point, because I was ruminating about it from some month now, because I said I have to start this at the end of the day. Well, yeah, I think I addressed some points that are important. Like, it's more about your own progressed motivation than about the thing in itself. Like the thing in itself is important, you should want it, but at the same time, it's obvious that you should be driven, right? You should believe in it. You should really make a gigantic effort to make it, even if, again, it costs, but it's still like, do you want to be worthy of it or not? Right? So in my case, I will tell you, because it's kind of almost not such maybe emotional story, but let's say it meant a lot for me at that point in my life, and for things that had happened to me, and eventually that would happen to me along the way. And so that's without that context, I could have never made the work the way it was. And you can't almost understand where one thing begins and the other ends, because they are so intertwined, even though they're still separately conceptually two separate things, right? And so probably, again, as I said, it was not even the research that had the greatest importance, but again, it's obvious, because it's the other things that you do and that you are that make the work the way it is, right? And that's why you should try it, because in my opinion, we can't have just this kind of, but we are heading towards a world that will need ever more education at those levels, widespread, right? But at the same time, today it's still an interesting challenge in spite of all the shortcomings and all these things, but it teaches you to be more resistant, to more resilient. I don't know how at this point, like the way this year went was so for me privately was not like very like a positive thing, and I must say that talking about this thing now makes me also reflect on, yes, I made this, but there are lots of other things to make. That is, if this was so hard, and it's just, after all, a thesis, right? Think about how many other hard things in life are, and how to expose yourself, and how difficult it is sometimes to literally get through the thing. It's hard in life sometimes, and that's where the motivation could also stem. I've met people who dedicated themselves wholeheartedly to this thing and to the profession in general, because, for example, they had to fight against their own demons. They had a tough background. I wasn't really like that, but I understand that there is something that when you achieve, of course, you unavoidably also lose in the process, and you have to be, in many ways, at different levels, and you must be prepared to that loss. You must be prepared to that change, to that sense of development, because you will have lost something, yes, but you will have developed some other capacity that is much more, important than sometimes you're even willing to think. So, and that's why I started this series, because I care about presenting this as the real story behind the thing, which doesn't happen often, because I don't know how many people who get through this make YouTube videos or tell their story, but I can tell you that maybe in this format, in this length, etc. No, it's almost like something formalistic. What is like a doctoral research? What is this? Or they hint just at it without even explaining what it is. Instead, we're going to the hardcore, worst nightmare like kind of scenario of what this thing actually is, and how to get out of it, and how you can handle the situation at all times with the necessary confidence and capacity. It's not, failure does exist, but it's not so frequent. There is often no interest to students, for even for the institution, for students to fail, right? It's just that, of course, you have to work, and you have to do it seriously, and so that's something that already should set you in the right mind, right? And it's a life experience. I mean, 3 years and a half of my life, and considering that it continues, because you have to publish this thesis later on, so you keep working at the work, and you keep going back on it, so it's really important. It can, in a way, would have been I guess for me, it would have been much better to just have finished even all this post thing, because I have such memories attached to the last year of PhD that they are somewhat terrible to me. So I can't, sometimes I can't go back on it without passing through that. That has nothing, the thing I said before, and I hope in this sense that this series will help me also get over certain things by getting through what I went through, and waking up after it, coming out of it for the first time, and breathing again, and therefore saying, well, let me look back at it and see what what it was, because yeah. But anyhow, for now I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.